Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. I'm here with another deep dive into the stories that shaped us, told the way they deserve to be told, slowly, carefully, and without the noise. Whether you're settling in for the night, working late, or just need something to quiet the chaos in your head, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're going back, way back. Not to the rise of civilizations or the birth of writing, but to something even more fundamental. We're tracing the entire arc of human language, from the first sounds that mattered to the digital words you're reading right now. This is the story of when humans first talked, and it begins long before anything we'd recognize as human even existed. If this kind of content helps you think, sleep, or simply escape for a while, a like and subscribe really does make a difference. It tells the algorithm that thoughtful, long-form content still has a place, and it helps other bored people find their way here. Let me know in the comments how you use these videos. Are you listening before bed, during a commute, while working? I'm curious where in the world you are and what brings you to stories like this. Now let's begin at the very beginning, in the forests of Africa, 7 million years ago, when the first sounds that would eventually become language were just starting to echo through the trees. The story of human language doesn't begin with humans. It begins with an absence, a silence we can never recover. Somewhere in the woodlands of ancient Africa, around 7 million years ago, lived a creature that was neither quite ape nor quite human. This was our last common ancestor, with chimpanzees and bonobos, and whatever sounds it made are lost forever to time. We call this the first voice we never heard, and it haunts the beginning of language because everything that followed, every word, every song, every conversation, traces back to the calls and cries of this vanished ancestor. What did they sound like? We can only guess by looking at our closest living relatives today. Modern chimpanzees have over 30 distinct vocalizations. They grunt when they find food, scream when they're threatened, and produce those long-distance pant hoots that carry through the forest canopy. Bonobos add their own repertoire of high-pitched peeps and barks that sound almost conversational. But these aren't language as we understand it. They're signals tied directly to immediate situations: hunger, fear, excitement, danger. The crucial difference is that animal calls are bound to the here and now. A food grunt happens when food appears. An alarm call erupts when a predator approaches. The sound is locked to the moment, the emotion, the circumstance. Language, on the other hand, allows us to break free from the immediate. We can describe yesterday's hunt, plan tomorrow's journey, or invent stories about things that never happened at all. Our 7 million year old ancestor couldn't do that. Their world was one of direct response. See fruit, make sound. Spot rival, make different sound. But within those limitations lay the building blocks of something extraordinary. These early apes lived in social groups where communication meant survival. The ability to warn others of danger, signal the discovery of food, or maintain bonds through vocal contact wasn't just useful, it was essential. What makes this moment so significant is that it represents a fork in the evolutionary road. From this shared ancestor, one lineage would lead to modern chimpanzees and bonobos, creatures that remained bound to immediate vocal responses. The other would eventually produce us, beings capable of describing not just what we see, but what we imagine, remember, and dream. The evolutionary pressures that shaped early communication were surprisingly complex. Group living meant navigating relationships, forming alliances, and maintaining social cohesion. Calls weren't just about information transfer, they were about managing the intricate web of primate politics. A gentle grunt during grooming could strengthen bonds. A sharp bark might establish dominance. The voice, even in its most primitive form, was already a social tool. But there's something else crucial happening in this prehistoric soundscape. These early apes weren't just making noise, they were listening. The ability to distinguish between different calls, to recognize individual voices, to understand subtle variations in tone and timing, was just as important as the ability to vocalize. Communication is always a two-way street. and the evolution of better hearing went hand in hand with the development of more sophisticated calls. We know from studying modern primates that vocal learning exists, though in limited forms. Young chimps don't just inherit their calls genetically, they refine them by listening to their mothers and group members. This suggests that even 7 million years ago, there was a cultural component to communication. Not culture as we understand it, but the beginnings of shared vocal traditions passed from generation to generation. The forest itself shaped these early voices. Dense vegetation favours low-frequency calls that can travel through thick foliage, while open spaces reward higher, sharper sounds. As our ancestors' environment changed, as forests fragmented and savannas expanded, the acoustic properties of their world shifted too. This environmental pressure may have been one of the first forces pushing vocal communication toward greater flexibility and range. What's particularly fascinating is that we can trace some of these ancient patterns in modern human behaviour. When we're excited, our voices rise. When we're trying to soothe someone, we often use lower, gentler tones. These aren't learned behaviours. They're echoes of vocal strategies that worked for our ancestors millions of years ago. The emotional core of communication runs deeper than language itself. The silence surrounding our 7 million-year-old ancestor is both frustrating and profound. We'll never know what their calls sounded like, never hear the timbre of their voices, or understand the subtle meanings embedded in their cries. But that silence also reminds us of something important. Language didn't appear fully formed. It evolved slowly, gradually, through countless small innovations and adaptations. Each generation of early apes faced the same basic challenges: how to survive, how to cooperate, how to pass on knowledge to their young. The solutions they found weren't dramatic breakthroughs, but incremental improvements. A slightly more flexible larynx here, a more sensitive ear there, a brain that could make more complex associations between sounds and meanings. By 7 million years ago, the stage was set for something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Not language itself, but the conditions that would eventually make language possible. Social complexity was creating pressure for better communication. Vocal anatomy was becoming more flexible. Brains were growing larger and more sophisticated. The pieces weren't assembled yet, but they were beginning to fall into place. The story of human language is often told as a series of revolutionary breakthroughs. The first word, the first grammar, the first story. But the real revolution may have been much quieter and more gradual. It was the slow accumulation of tiny changes that, over millions of years, transformed simple animal calls into something infinitely more powerful and complex. Our 7 million-year-old ancestor made sounds that mattered to their survival and their community. They called to their young, warned of dangers, celebrated discoveries. These weren't words, but they were meaningful. They carried information, emotion, and social significance. In that sense, they were already proto-language, the raw material from which everything else would eventually emerge. The haunting beauty of this beginning is that it connects us to something much larger than human history. Every time we speak, we're participating in an unbroken chain of vocal communication that stretches back through deep time. The breath that carries our words, the social bonds that give them meaning, the neural pathways that process them. All of these have roots that extend far beyond our species, yet we also carry the weight of all those lost voices. Every extinct lineage of early apes took with them their own experiments in communication. We're not the inevitable outcome of vocal evolution. We're just the branch that happened to survive and flourish. The silence of our ancestors reminds us that language, for all its power and beauty, is also fragile. It exists only as long as there are voices to carry it forward. As we begin to trace the long path from these first meaningful sounds to the complex languages of today, we carry with us the echo of that original silence. The first voice we never heard shapes every word that follows, a ghostly presence that reminds us where we came from and how far we've travelled. The story of language is ultimately the story of connection between individuals, between generations, between past and future. It begins in the forests of ancient Africa with creatures who had something to say to each other, even if they couldn't yet say it in words. From those first meaningful sounds would eventually emerge poetry and philosophy, science and story, all the ways humans have learned to share the contents of their minds. But that transformation would take millions of years and countless innovations. The path from animal calls to human conversation was neither straight nor simple. It wound through anatomical changes and cognitive breakthroughs, through cultural innovations and environmental pressures, through experiments that succeeded and others that failed entirely. This is where our journey truly begins, not with the first word, but with the first sound that carried meaning from one mind to another, 7 million years ago in the fading light of an African forest that no longer exists. From those ancient forest echoes, we move forward through deep time to encounter our first recognizable ancestors. Around 4 million years ago, in the dusty landscapes of what we now call Ethiopia, lived a small, upright ape whose partial skeleton would one day become famous. We know her as Lucy, and she represents a crucial moment in our story, not because she could speak, but because of what her silence reveals about the long road to language. Lucy and her kind, the Australopithecines, were walking upright, but still carried the vocal limitations of their ape heritage. Their throats contained air sacs, balloon-like structures that amplified their calls but came with a significant trade-off. These sacs made their voices loud and resonant, perfect for long-distance communication across the savannah, but they also muddied the clarity of individual sounds. Imagine trying to form precise vowels while your throat constantly vibrates like an echo chamber. This anatomical constraint meant that Lucy's world was filled with powerful, booming calls, but lacked the crisp distinctions between sounds that language requires. She could hoot, grunt, and cry out with impressive volume, but the subtle differences between R and E and O would have been lost in the resonant blur of her amplified voice. Her communication was effective for her world, but it was still a world without words. Yet Lucy's upright posture was already setting the stage for future developments. When our ancestors stood up and began walking on two legs, they freed their hands from locomotion. Those newly available hands could now gesture, point, and shape meaning in ways that quadrupedal apes never could. While Lucy's voice remained limited by her anatomy, her hands were already beginning to speak. The archaeological evidence shows that Lucy's kind lived in small groups, probably 20 to 30 individuals, moving across a landscape that mixed forests with expanding grasslands. Their stone tools were simple, sharp flakes and crude choppers, but they represent something profound. Tool-making requires instruction, and instruction requires some form of communication, sophisticated enough to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Picture a group of Australopithecines gathered around a rocky outcrop, one of them demonstrating how to strike stone against stone to produce a sharp edge. Without words, this teaching would have relied heavily on gesture, demonstration, and mimicry. Point to the stone, show the grip, demonstrate the angle of strike. The hands were already beginning to carry the burden of complex communication that the voice couldn't yet manage. This gestural foundation may have been more important than we initially realized. Modern research shows that human children often gesture before they speak, pointing and reaching to communicate needs and desires. Even today, when we talk, our hands move in unconscious accompaniment, as if they remember their ancient role as the primary bearers of meaning. Lucy's brain was small compared to ours, about the size of a chimpanzee's, but it was already showing signs of reorganization. The areas associated with tool use and hand coordination were expanding, laying the groundwork for the neural networks that would eventually support language. In a sense, her hands were teaching her brain how to handle complex, structured communication. The social world of the Australopithecines was becoming more complex too. They lived in multi-male, multi-female groups with intricate relationships and hierarchies. Managing these social bonds required increasingly sophisticated communication. Who was allied with whom? Which individuals could be trusted? What were the unspoken rules that held the group together? Without language, this social navigation relied on a rich vocabulary of gestures, facial expressions, and vocal calls. A raised hand might signal submission or aggression. A particular grunt could indicate approval or warning. Eye contact, posture, and proximity all carried meaning. Lucy's world was far from silent. It was filled with communication, just not the kind we would recognize as language. The expansion of grasslands during this period created new challenges and opportunities. Open spaces meant greater visibility, but also greater vulnerability to predators. Coordinated group movement became essential for survival. The ability to signal direction, warn of dangers, and maintain contact across distances would have placed increasing pressure on communication systems. We can imagine Lucy's group moving across the savannah, individuals maintaining contact through a constant stream of low-level vocalizations and gestures. Not conversation as we know it, but a continuous flow of social information that kept the group coordinated and cohesive. This kind of ongoing communication would have strengthened the neural pathways associated with vocal control and social awareness. The fossil record from this period also shows evidence of increasingly sophisticated food processing. Australopithecines were using tools not just to cut meat, but to crack nuts, dig for tubers, and process tough plant materials. Each of these activities required knowledge that had to be transmitted from experienced individuals to novices. Teaching someone to crack nuts efficiently isn't just about showing them where to hit. It requires understanding leverage, timing, and the subtle signs that indicate when a nut is ready to break. This kind of knowledge transfer pushes communication systems toward greater precision and complexity, even without formal language. The anatomy of Lucy's species reveals another crucial development. Their rib cages were beginning to change shape, becoming more barrel-like and less conical than those of earlier apes. This shift suggests improvements in breath control, a necessary foundation for any form of complex vocalization. While Lucy couldn't yet sustain the long controlled exhalations that speech requires, her lineage was moving in that direction. The brain changes were subtle but significant. The areas associated with sequential processing, the ability to understand and produce ordered sequences of actions or sounds, were beginning to expand. This neural development was probably driven initially by tool use, which requires precise sequences of movements, but it laid the groundwork for the sequential nature of language. Lucy's world was also becoming more seasonal and unpredictable. Climate fluctuations meant that food sources could disappear rapidly, forcing groups to adapt their strategies and communicate about changing conditions. The ability to share information about distant resources, remember successful strategies from previous seasons, and coordinate group responses to environmental challenges would have provided significant survival advantages. The archaeological sites from this period show evidence of food sharing and communal processing areas. Groups were working together to process large carcasses and distribute resources. This kind of cooperation requires not just individual communication, but group consensus and planning. The social machinery that would eventually support language was already taking shape. What's particularly striking about Lucy's era is how it balances continuity with innovation. The basic social structures, the reliance on gesture and vocal calls, the small group sizes, all of these echo the patterns of earlier apes. But underneath this familiar surface, new capabilities were emerging. Better breath control, more flexible hand use, expanding brain regions, and increasingly complex social coordination. Lucy couldn't whisper secrets or tell stories, but she lived in a world where meaning mattered, where communication was essential for survival, and where the pressure for better, more precise ways of sharing information was constantly growing. Her silence speaks to us across 4 million years, reminding us that language didn't appear suddenly, but grew slowly from foundations that were already being laid in the dust of ancient Africa. The Australopithecines represent a crucial bridge between the purely gestural world of earlier apes and the vocal complexity that would eventually emerge. They show us a species caught between two modes of communication, still relying heavily on the ancient language of hands and faces, but beginning to explore the possibilities of more sophisticated vocal expression. In Lucy's fossilized bones, we see not the beginning of language, but the patient preparation for it. The anatomical changes, the neural developments, the social pressures, all building towards something that wouldn't fully emerge for millions of years. She reminds us that evolution doesn't work in sudden leaps, but in gradual accumulations, each generation adding small improvements that eventually transform everything. As we follow the thread of human evolution forward from Lucy's time, we carry with us the image of small groups moving across ancient landscapes, their hands busy with tools and gestures, their voices limited but meaningful, their brains slowly rewiring themselves for something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth: the ability to transform thoughts into sounds and sounds into shared understanding. The path from Lucy's gestural world to human language was long and complex, marked by anatomical innovations, cognitive breakthroughs, and social pressures that we're only beginning to understand. But in her upright posture, her tool use, and her social complexity, we can already see the foundations being laid for the most remarkable development in the story of our species. The silence that followed Lucy's era wasn't empty. It was expectant, pregnant with possibilities that wouldn't fully emerge for another 2 million years. As we trace the thread forward through deep time, we encounter a species that represents one of the most significant leaps in our journey toward language: Homo erectus, the first humans to leave Africa and scatter across the ancient world. Around 1.8 million years ago, something remarkable happened. The robust, ape-like features of earlier hominins began to give way to something more familiar. Homo erectus stood tall, with long legs built for walking vast distances, and most importantly, for our story, they possessed the first throats that could potentially support something approaching speech. Not language as we know it, but the anatomical foundation upon which language could eventually be built. The key difference lay in their breathing. Unlike Lucy and her kin, Homo erectus had developed more sophisticated control over their respiratory system. Their rib cages had evolved into a more modern configuration, and their spinal cords showed evidence of neural pathways that could support the fine motor control necessary for sustained, controlled breathing. This matters because speech requires something that no animal call demands: the ability to regulate airflow with extraordinary precision. Think about what happens when you speak. Every syllable requires exact coordination between your diaphragm, your vocal cords, and the muscles of your throat and mouth. You need to push air out at just the right pressure, for just the right duration, while simultaneously shaping your vocal tract to produce specific sounds. It's one of the most complex motor tasks humans perform, and Homo erectus was the first species with the anatomical equipment to potentially manage it. But anatomy alone doesn't create language. What made Homo erectus truly significant was their behavior. These were the first humans to spread beyond Africa, walking across vast landscapes, adapting to new climates, and maintaining cultural traditions across enormous distances. Their stone tools, the famous hand axes, remained virtually unchanged for over 1 million years, suggesting a level of cultural transmission that required sophisticated communication. Imagine trying to teach someone to make a perfectly symmetrical hand axe using only gestures and grunts. The process requires understanding not just the final product, but the sequence of strikes, the angle of approach, the way force should be applied. This kind of knowledge transfer pushes communication systems toward greater complexity, even if that complexity doesn't yet qualify as full language. The archaeological evidence shows Homo erectus living in larger groups than their predecessors, coordinating hunts of massive animals and maintaining fire across generations. Fire, in particular, represents a communicative challenge of the highest order. Keeping flames alive requires constant attention, shared responsibility, and the ability to pass knowledge about fuel, timing, and safety from elders to newcomers. Picture a group of Homo erectus gathered around their fire. As darkness falls across the ancient landscape, the flames cast dancing shadows on their faces as they communicate about the day's events, the next day's plans, the lessons that need to be shared with the young. Their voices would have been capable of a wider range of sounds than any previous hominin, though still far from the complexity of modern speech. Recent analysis of Homo erectus fossils suggests they may have been the first hominins to lose the air sacs that had limited their ancestors' vocal clarity. Without these resonating chambers, their voices would have gained precision at the cost of volume, a crucial trade-off that prioritized the subtle distinctions between sounds over raw acoustic power. This anatomical shift represents a fundamental change in communication strategy, from long-distance broadcasting to close-range precision. The implications are staggering. For the first time in hominin evolution, we have a species that could potentially produce the kind of controlled, varied vocalizations that language requires. Not full speech, but something approaching it. Perhaps what linguists call proto-language, a system of meaningful sounds that lack the full grammatical complexity of modern human communication. What might this proto-language have sounded like? Probably a mixture of meaningful vocal sounds, elaborate gestures, and contextual cues that together could convey complex information. Individual words or sound-meaning pairs that could be combined in simple ways, but lacked the recursive, generative grammar that makes human language infinitely creative. The fossil record provides tantalizing hints about the cognitive capabilities of Homo erectus. Their brain size had increased significantly from earlier hominins, approaching 2/3 the size of modern human brains. More importantly, the shape had changed, with expanded areas associated with motor control, planning, and social coordination. These neural developments would have supported more sophisticated communication, even if the full flowering of language was still far in the future. The geographic spread of Homo erectus tells its own story about communication. Groups separated by thousands of miles maintained remarkably similar tool-making traditions, suggesting either ongoing contact or shared cultural knowledge that could survive separation. Either scenario requires communication systems sophisticated enough to preserve and transmit complex information across space and time. Consider the challenges these early travelers faced. Moving into new environments meant encountering unfamiliar plants, animals, and weather patterns. Survival required not just individual adaptation, but group coordination and knowledge sharing. The ability to describe new resources, warn of novel dangers, and adapt existing strategies to new circumstances would have provided enormous selective advantages. The sites left behind by Homo erectus reveal evidence of increasingly complex social organization. Living floors show specialized areas for different activities, suggesting planned use of space and coordinated group behavior. Some sites contain evidence of food sharing on a scale that implies sophisticated social rules about distribution and reciprocity. These behavioral innovations create a feedback loop with communication. More complex social organization requires better communication, which enables even more complex organization, which drives further improvements in communication. Homo erectus appears to have been caught in this upward spiral, gradually developing the social and cognitive foundations that would eventually support full language. The time frame is crucial to understanding this development. Homo erectus persisted for nearly 2 million years, maintaining their basic anatomy and tool technology across vast spans of time and space. This stability suggests a successful, adaptive strategy, but it also implies that their communication systems, while more advanced than their predecessors, were still limited compared to what was coming. The vocal capabilities of Homo erectus likely existed in a middle ground, more flexible and precise than earlier hominins, but still lacking the full range and control of modern human speech. They could probably produce a variety of vowel and consonant sounds, combine them in meaningful ways, and use vocal communication for coordination and social bonding. But they probably couldn't sustain the long, complex utterances that characterize human language. This intermediate stage is actually more important than it might initially seem. Language didn't appear fully formed. It evolved gradually through stages of increasing complexity. Homo erectus represents a crucial step in this progression, the point at which vocal communication became sophisticated enough to support complex culture, but hadn't yet reached the recursive, generative power of modern language. The archaeological evidence suggests that, by the end of their tenure, some populations of Homo erectus may have been approaching the threshold of true language. Sites from late in their evolutionary history show evidence of increasingly sophisticated behavior, including possible symbolic objects and more complex tool technologies. These developments hint at expanding cognitive capabilities that were pushing the boundaries of what their communication systems could handle. What's particularly fascinating is how this species managed to maintain cultural traditions across such vast distances and time periods without full language. Their success suggests that proto-language, a communication system more complex than animal calls but simpler than human speech, can support remarkably sophisticated cultures under the right conditions. The legacy of Homo erectus extends far beyond their own existence. The anatomical and cognitive foundations they developed became the platform upon which later species would build increasingly sophisticated communication systems. Their controlled breathing, their flexible vocal tracts, their expanded brains, and their complex social organization created the conditions necessary for the eventual emergence of full human language. As we follow the evolutionary thread forward from Homo erectus, we carry with us an image of early humans gathered around fires across the ancient world, their voices carrying meaning through the darkness, their hands shaping tools and gestures, their minds grappling with the challenges of coordination and cooperation that would eventually drive the development of our species' most remarkable achievements. The path from Homo erectus to modern language was neither straight nor simple, but in their controlled breathing and expanding social complexity, we can see the foundations being laid for everything that would follow. They remind us that language, like all evolutionary developments, emerged gradually through countless small innovations, each building upon the last, until something unprecedented in the history of life finally took shape in the throats and minds of our more recent ancestors. The story takes a dramatic turn around 400,000 years ago when we encounter Homo heidelbergensis, a species that may have possessed the first throats truly capable of supporting complex speech. Deep in the caves of northern Spain, at a site called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. A fossilized hyoid bone, that delicate horseshoe-shaped structure that anchors the tongue and supports the larynx in the throat. This tiny bone, no bigger than your thumb, represents one of the most significant discoveries in the study of human language evolution. In modern apes, the hyoid supports air sacs that make calls louder but less precise. In humans, it sits lower in the throat, creating a longer vocal tract that allows for the full range of vowel sounds that speech requires. The hyoid from Cima de los Huesos looked remarkably similar to our own. The implications are staggering. By 400,000 years ago, at least some human ancestors had developed the anatomical foundation necessary for articulate speech. Not just grunts and calls, but potentially the kind of controlled, varied vocalizations that could carry the complexity of true language. The machinery was in place, even if we can't know for certain how it was used. Homo heidelbergensis lived in a world that demanded sophisticated communication. They hunted massive animals like elephants and rhinoceros, requiring coordination on a scale that simple gestures couldn't support. They controlled fire reliably, maintaining hearths that burned for generations. Most remarkably, they deliberately placed dozens of bodies in that Spanish cave shaft, an act that speaks to ritual behavior and shared cultural meaning. Picture these early humans standing at the edge of that dark pit, perhaps chanting or speaking words we'll never recover as they lowered their dead into the depths. The hyoid bone suggests they had the vocal equipment for such ceremonies, though the words themselves are lost forever to time. We can only imagine voices echoing in the limestone darkness, carrying meanings that bound communities together in ways that pure gesture never could. The brain cases of Homo heidelbergensis were approaching modern size, often exceeding 200 cubic centimeters. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. It's the organization that matters. Fossil evidence suggests significant development in areas associated with motor control and sequential processing, the neural foundations necessary for stringing sounds together in meaningful patterns. Their tool technology reveals minds capable of long-term planning and cultural transmission. The hand axes of this period show remarkable consistency across vast geographic ranges, suggesting shared knowledge that could persist across generations. Teaching someone to create a perfectly balanced, symmetrical hand axe requires more than demonstration. It demands the kind of detailed instruction that pushes communication systems toward greater complexity. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from their apparent use of wooden spears. At Schöningen in Germany, researchers discovered wooden hunting spears dating to 400,000 years ago, carved from spruce trees and designed with the aerodynamic principles of modern javelins. Creating such weapons requires not just skill, but the ability to pass on precise technical knowledge about wood selection, carving techniques, and weight distribution. The social implications are equally significant. Living in groups large enough to hunt megafauna requires sophisticated coordination and conflict resolution. Managing relationships, maintaining alliances, and navigating the complex social hierarchies of large groups pushes communication systems toward the kind of nuanced expression that human language provides. Without some form of articulate speech, it's difficult to imagine how such societies could have functioned. Recent analysis of fossilized ear bones from this period reveals another crucial piece of the puzzle. The middle ear structures of Homo heidelbergensis show adaptations for hearing the kinds of frequencies that human speech occupies, particularly the range where consonants and rapid sound changes are most important. Their ears were tuned not just for environmental sounds, but for the subtle acoustic distinctions that speech requires. This creates a feedback loop that drives language evolution. Better vocal production leads to selection for better hearing, which creates pressure for even more sophisticated vocalizations. By 400,000 years ago, this acoustic arms race had produced humans with both the equipment to produce complex sounds and the sensory apparatus to perceive them with unprecedented precision. The geographic distribution of Homo heidelbergensis tells its own story about communication. Populations spread across Africa, Europe, and possibly Asia maintain technological and behavioral similarities that suggest ongoing cultural exchange or deeply embedded shared traditions. Either scenario requires communication systems sophisticated enough to preserve and transmit complex information across vast distances and long time periods. Climate data from this period reveals a world of environmental instability, with ice ages cycling every 100,000 years or so. Surviving such dramatic environmental changes would have required behavioral flexibility and cultural adaptation on an unprecedented scale. Groups needed to share information about changing resources, coordinate responses to new challenges, and maintain social cohesion through periods of stress and scarcity. The archaeological evidence suggests that Homo heidelbergensis may have been the first humans to engage in what we might recognize as symbolic behavior. Some sites contain objects that seem to have been collected for their aesthetic rather than functional properties. Crystals, fossils, and unusually shaped stones that serve no obvious utilitarian purpose. This hints at minds capable of abstract thought and symbolic representation, cognitive prerequisites for language. Fire use becomes more sophisticated and widespread during this period, with evidence of controlled burning for land management and possibly cooking techniques that required precise timing and temperature control. Managing fire across generations requires not just technical knowledge, but cultural institutions for passing that knowledge along. The complexity of information that needed to be transmitted was pushing communication systems toward their limits. The fossil record also shows the first clear evidence of care for the disabled and elderly. At several sites, researchers have found skeletons showing signs of severe injuries or disabilities that would have required long-term care from group members. This kind of sustained altruism requires the social bonds and communication systems that allow groups to function as true communities rather than mere aggregations of individuals. What emerges from the evidence is a picture of humans who are anatomically and cognitively poised on the threshold of language. They had the vocal equipment, the hearing, the brain organization, and the social complexity that language requires. Whether they actually spoke in ways we would recognize remains one of the great mysteries of human evolution, but the foundations were clearly in place. The transition from the gestural, limited vocal communication of earlier humans to something approaching true language may have occurred gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. Homo heidelbergensis appears to represent a crucial stage in this process, the point at which all the necessary components had finally come together in a single species. Their legacy extends far beyond their own existence. The anatomical innovations, cognitive developments, and cultural complexity they achieved became the platform upon which later species would build the full flowering of human language. In their fossil remains, we see not the beginning of speech, but the completion of its preparation, the final assembly of all the pieces that would eventually allow humans to transform thoughts into words and words into civilization. The silence that surrounds these early humans is both frustrating and profound. We can see the machinery of language in their bones, but we cannot hear the voices that may have used it. We can trace the anatomical evolution that made speech possible, but we cannot recover the first words that may have been spoken around their fires. What we can do is recognize that by 400,000 years ago, the biological and social foundations of human language were essentially complete, waiting for the cultural innovations that would finally unlock their full potential. As we continue forward through the archaeological record, we move from the realm of anatomical possibility into the territory of behavioral evidence, the first clear signs that humans were not just capable of language, but were actually using it to create the complex cultures that would define our species. From those anatomical foundations, we enter one of the most fascinating periods in our story, the era when modern humans first began leaving clear traces of symbolic thought. Around 100,000 years ago, in the limestone caves along South Africa's coast, something unprecedented was happening. Humans weren't just using their newly capable vocal apparatus, they were beginning to create external symbols that could carry meaning beyond the immediate moment. At Blombos Cave, overlooking the Indian Ocean, archaeologists discovered something that changed our understanding of early human cognition. Pieces of red ochre, carefully engraved with geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines that repeat with deliberate precision. These weren't random scratches or accidental marks. They were intentional symbols created by minds that could attach abstract meaning to physical objects. The significance extends beyond the engravings themselves. Ochre doesn't occur naturally in caves. It has to be collected, sometimes from sources many kilometers away. The pieces at Blombos show signs of being ground into powder, mixed with other materials, and likely applied to skin or objects. This represents a chain of planned behavior that stretches from collection through processing to application, a cognitive sequence that mirrors the kind of abstract thinking that language requires. But ochre wasn't the only innovation. Alongside these engraved pieces, researchers found perforated shells, tiny marine snails that had been pierced and likely strung as beads. Some still bore traces of ochre, suggesting they were part of a system of personal ornamentation that communicated information about identity, status, or group membership. The creation of symbolic objects like these represents a cognitive threshold that parallels the development of language. Both require the ability to let one thing stand for another, a sound for a concept, a pattern for a meaning, a coloured bead for a social identity. The minds that could create these symbols were minds ready for the full complexity of linguistic communication. The timeline is crucial. By 100,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans had been present in Africa for at least 200,000 years, but symbolic behaviour remained rare and localised. What changed wasn't their anatomy. That had been essentially modern for millennia, but their culture. The cognitive machinery for language had been assembled. Now it was finally being put to use in ways that left lasting traces. The archaeological evidence suggests this wasn't an isolated development. Similar innovations appear at roughly the same time across different parts of Africa. Shell beads appear at sites in North Africa and the Levant. Ochre use becomes more systematic and widespread. Stone tools begin showing regional variations that suggest cultural traditions maintained through social learning rather than genetic inheritance. This pattern points to something remarkable: the emergence of what we might call cultural language, communication systems sophisticated enough to maintain and transmit complex traditions across generations and geographic distances. Not just the ability to speak, but the use of speech to create and preserve cultural knowledge that extended beyond individual experience. The social implications are staggering. Creating and maintaining symbolic traditions requires shared understanding across entire communities. When someone at Blombos carefully engraved those geometric patterns, they were operating within a cultural framework that gave those patterns meaning. Others in their community could look at the engravings and understand their significance, even if we can no longer decode that meaning today. This kind of shared symbolic understanding is impossible without sophisticated language. You can teach someone to make a stone tool through demonstration and mimicry, but you can't explain the cultural significance of a particular pattern or colour without words that can carry abstract concepts from one mind to another. The genetic evidence supports this cultural flowering. Around this same period, studies of human DNA suggest population expansions and increased interaction between different groups across Africa. Larger, more connected populations create the social conditions where cultural innovations can spread and stabilize, while also providing the demographic pressure that drives communication systems toward greater complexity. Climate data reveals another piece of the puzzle. The period around 100,000 years ago was marked by environmental instability, with dramatic swings between wet and dry conditions across much of Africa. These climate fluctuations would have created survival challenges that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and cultural adaptation. Imagine groups of early humans facing a severe drought that forced them to abandon traditional territories and seek resources in unfamiliar regions. Success would have depended not just on individual survival skills, but on the ability to share information about new environments, coordinate group movements, and maintain social cohesion under stress. These challenges would have created intense selective pressure for better communication systems. The archaeological record from this period shows evidence of increasingly complex tool technologies that required precise cultural transmission. The production of hafted spears with stone points, for example, involves knowledge of adhesives, binding techniques, and the aerodynamic properties that make effective weapons. This kind of technical knowledge is difficult to transmit without language capable of describing procedures, explaining cause and effect relationships, and correcting mistakes. Fire management also reached new levels of sophistication during this period. Evidence suggests not just the maintenance of fires, but the deliberate use of different types of wood for specific purposes, controlled burning for land management, and possibly the earliest attempts at food preservation through smoking and drying. Each of these innovations required cultural knowledge that could only be preserved and transmitted through articulate speech. The emergence of long-distance exchange networks provides another window into early human communication. Objects like high-quality stone for tools and marine shells for ornamentation appear at sites hundreds of kilometers from their sources. Maintaining such exchange relationships requires the ability to communicate about abstract concepts, like value, reciprocity, and future obligations, cognitive territory that only language can navigate. Social organization was becoming more complex as well. Group sizes were growing, and there's evidence of specialized roles within communities. Some individuals focused on tool production, others on resource procurement, still others on maintaining cultural knowledge. This kind of specialization requires communication systems that can coordinate different activities and ensure that specialized knowledge isn't lost when individual experts die. The treatment of the dead also becomes more elaborate during this period. Burials show evidence of grave goods, body positioning that suggests ritual significance, and the use of ochre in mortuary contexts. These practices require shared beliefs about death, afterlife, or spiritual continuity, concepts that can only be maintained and transmitted through language capable of dealing with abstract non-material realities. Perhaps most significantly, this period sees the first clear evidence of what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, the full suite of capabilities that characterize contemporary human societies. Not just individual innovations like symbolic objects or complex tools, but integrated cultural systems that could maintain themselves across generations and adapt to changing circumstances. The transition wasn't immediate or uniform. Different populations developed these capabilities at different rates, and some groups remained technologically and culturally conservative for thousands of years. But by 70,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows clear evidence of humans living in communities bound together by shared symbols, complex technologies, and cultural traditions that could only be maintained through sophisticated language. This represents a fundamental shift in the human experience. For the first time, individual survival depended not just on personal knowledge and skills, but on participation in cultural systems that existed beyond any single lifetime. Language had become not just a tool for immediate communication, but the foundation of cumulative culture, the ability of human societies to build knowledge and complexity across generations. The implications extended far beyond Africa. Around 70,000 years ago, groups of humans began leaving the continent in what would become the most successful migration in human history. But they weren't leaving as simple hunter-gatherers with basic survival skills. They were carrying with them sophisticated cultural systems maintained by language, symbol systems that could adapt to new environments, and social technologies that would allow them to colonize every habitable continent on Earth. The fossil record from this crucial period is frustratingly sparse, but the archaeological evidence tells a clear story. By 100,000 years ago, humans had crossed the threshold from anatomical modernity to behavioral modernity. They possessed not just the capacity for language, but were actively using that capacity to create the complex cultures that would define our species. The silence that surrounds these early symbolic humans is different from the silence of their predecessors. Lucy's silence was the silence of limitation, communication constrained by anatomy and cognition. The silence of Homo heidelbergensis was the silence of possibility, the machinery of language assembled but perhaps not yet fully deployed. But the silence of these early symbolic humans is the silence of lost meaning. They were speaking, creating, transmitting culture, but their words have vanished into time, leaving only the material traces of minds fully engaged in the symbolic construction of meaning. As we follow the thread forward from this crucial threshold, we enter the final phase of our story, the period when language-enabled humans spread across the globe, diversified into thousands of distinct cultures, and began the process of cultural evolution that would eventually produce writing, literature, science, and all the other achievements that define human civilization. The biological evolution of language was essentially complete. What remained was its cultural elaboration into the infinite variety of human expression we see today. The journey from these first symbolic humans to the global diaspora that followed represents one of the most dramatic chapters in our species' story. Around 70,000 years ago, small groups of humans began walking out of Africa, carrying with them not just their genes and tools, but something far more powerful: languages sophisticated enough to adapt, survive, and flourish in entirely new worlds. This wasn't humanity's first attempt to leave Africa. Earlier migrations had reached as far as the Levant and possibly beyond, but those pioneers left no lasting legacy. Their settlements vanished, their lineages died out, their voices fell silent. What made this migration different wasn't an anatomy or technology, it was language. The humans who left Africa 70,000 years ago possessed communication systems sophisticated enough to maintain cultural coherence across vast distances and changing environments. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of remarkable success. Within just a few thousand years, humans had reached Southeast Asia and Australia, crossing open ocean in boats that required coordinated construction and navigation. They spread across the Eurasian steppes, adapting to climates and ecosystems their African ancestors had never encountered. By 45,000 years ago, they had entered Europe, and by 15,000 years ago, they had reached the Americas. Each of these expansions required more than individual courage or survival skills. They demanded the kind of cultural knowledge that can only be preserved and transmitted through language. How to build seaworthy boats, navigate by stars, identify edible plants in foreign landscapes, coordinate hunts of unfamiliar animals. This knowledge had to travel with the migrants, carried not in their genes, but in their words. The speed of human expansion suggests something unprecedented in mammalian evolution. Most species take hundreds of thousands or millions of years to colonize new continents. Humans did it in tens of thousands. The difference was cultural rather than biological, the ability to rapidly develop and share adaptive solutions to environmental challenges through linguistic communication. But language didn't just enable expansion, it also began to fragment and diversify in ways that would shape human history for millennia to come. As populations spread and became isolated, their languages began to drift apart. Sounds changed, vocabularies diverged, grammatical structures evolved in different directions. What had once been a unified communication system slowly split into the thousands of distinct languages that would characterize human diversity. This linguistic diversification wasn't random. It followed patterns that reflected the geography of human migration and the social dynamics of small populations. Languages changed fastest when populations were small and isolated, slowest when groups remained large and connected. Mountain ranges, deserts, and oceans created barriers that accelerated linguistic divergence, while rivers, coastlines, and trade routes promoted continued contact and mutual influence. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of cultural innovation that parallels the linguistic diversification. Regional tool traditions emerge, artistic styles develop local characteristics, and burial practices begin to vary in ways that suggest distinct cultural identities. This is the signature of language at work, not just enabling communication within groups, but creating the cultural boundaries that define different communities. The most dramatic evidence comes from the cave art of Ice Age Europe. Beginning around 45,000 years ago, humans were creating sophisticated paintings in deep limestone caverns. Works of art that required not just individual skill, but cultural knowledge about pigments, techniques, and symbolic meanings. The consistency of artistic conventions across different sites suggests shared cultural traditions that could only be maintained through linguistic communication. These aren't simple pictures of animals, they're complex symbolic systems that encoded information about hunting, ritual, social organization, and spiritual beliefs. The famous paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet represent the work of societies that had developed not just language, but literature. Narrative traditions sophisticated enough to preserve and transmit complex cultural knowledge across generations. The evidence for music appears around the same time. Bone flutes with precisely drilled finger holes have been found at sites across Europe, instruments capable of producing specific pitches and scales. Music, like language, is a system of structured sound that follows rules and carries meaning. The development of musical traditions suggests minds capable of the kind of abstract pattern recognition that underlies both artistic expression and linguistic grammar. Social organization was reaching new levels of complexity as well. Ice Age sites show evidence of seasonal aggregations where multiple bands would come together for trade, mate exchange, and cultural ceremonies. Maintaining relationships across such large social networks requires communication systems that can handle abstract concepts, like kinship obligations, territorial boundaries, and reciprocal agreements. The treatment of the dead becomes increasingly elaborate during this period. Burials show evidence of status differences, specialized grave goods, and ritual practices that suggest complex beliefs about identity, afterlife, and social continuity. Some individuals were buried with thousands of carefully crafted beads or other ornaments, suggesting societies that could invest enormous amounts of labor in purely symbolic expressions. Tool technology reaches unprecedented sophistication. The production of specialized implements, different tools for different tasks, weapons designed for specific prey, implements crafted for particular environments, requires cultural knowledge that extends far beyond individual experience. This is the signature of cumulative cultural evolution, the process by which human societies build complexity across generations through linguistic transmission. The genetic evidence tells its own story about this period. DNA studies suggest that the populations leaving Africa carried with them the full range of cognitive capabilities that characterize modern humans, but they also show evidence of the founder effects and population bottlenecks that would shape human diversity for millennia. Small founding populations meant that chance played a large role in determining which linguistic and cultural innovations survived. Climate played a crucial role as well. The period of human expansion coincided with dramatic environmental changes as ice ages cycled and sea levels fluctuated. Groups had to adapt rapidly to changing conditions, and those with more flexible cultural systems, maintained through sophisticated language, were more likely to survive and proliferate. The archaeological evidence suggests that by 40,000 years ago, humans had developed what archaeologists call the full package of modern behavior. Not just individual capabilities like symbolic thought or complex tool use, but integrated cultural systems that could generate and maintain the kind of complexity we associate with human civilization. Language wasn't just a tool in this process, it was the foundation. Every other human achievement, from art to technology to social organization, depended on the ability to share complex information across individuals and generations. The cave paintings of France, the bone flutes of Germany, the sophisticated hunting technologies of Siberia, all of these emerged from communities bound together by shared languages that could preserve and transmit cultural knowledge. The transition from biological to cultural evolution was essentially complete. Human anatomy would change little over the following millennia, but human culture would explode into infinite variety. Languages would diversify into thousands of distinct forms, each adapted to its own environment and social context, each carrying its own unique perspective on human experience. The silence that surrounds these early global humans is the silence of distance and time. We know they were speaking, creating, innovating, but their actual words are lost forever. We can see the material traces of their cultural achievements, but we cannot hear the languages that made those achievements possible. Their voices carried human meaning to every corner of the earth, but they echo only in the archaeological fragments they left behind. What we can trace, however, are the patterns of linguistic change that began during this crucial period. The diversification of human language from its African origins into the thousands of distinct forms documented by historical linguistics represents one of the most complex evolutionary processes ever studied. Each language that emerged carried with it traces of the original human linguistic capacity, but also innovations and adaptations that reflected the unique experiences of its speakers. The story of human language expansion is ultimately the story of human adaptability. In less than 70,000 years, humans went from a single population in Africa to a global species speaking thousands of different languages, each perfectly adapted to its environment and culture. This represents an evolutionary achievement unparalleled in the history of life on Earth, the transformation of a biological capacity into a cultural phenomenon of infinite variety and complexity. The foundation laid by these early speaking humans would support every subsequent human achievement. The agricultural revolution, the development of writing, the emergence of cities and civilizations, the scientific revolution, the digital age, all of these depend on the linguistic foundations established during humanity's great expansion across the globe. Yet even as we marvel at this achievement, we must remember its fragility. Languages live only in the mouths of their speakers, and when those speakers are gone, the languages die with them. The diversity created during humanity's global expansion is now under threat as globalization and modernization favor a few dominant languages over the thousands of smaller ones. The same forces that once drove linguistic diversification, migration, isolation, adaptation to local conditions, now work in reverse. Modern communication technologies, global economic systems, and political structures favor linguistic unification over diversity. We may be witnessing the end of the great diversification that began 70,000 years ago. As we trace the thread from those first symbolic humans in African caves to the globally distributed, linguistically diverse species we became, we see both the power and the vulnerability of human language. It enabled our species' greatest achievements, but it remains as fragile as the communities that speak it. The story of human language is not just about how we learn to talk. It's about how we use that ability to transform ourselves from a regional African species into the dominant force on Earth. The echoes of those first words spoken around African fires still resonate in every language spoken today. In the basic structures of grammar, the universal patterns of sound change, the fundamental ways humans organize meaning and transmit culture, we can still trace the outlines of our species' first conversations. Language didn't just give us the power to communicate, it gave us the power to become human in the fullest sense, creatures capable of sharing not just information, but dreams, fears, hopes, and the entire range of conscious experience that defines our species. The silence that followed the Great Expansion wasn't empty. It was filled with thousands of new voices, each finding its own way to express the fundamental human experience of being conscious, social, and creative in an infinite universe. From those African origins emerged not just human language, but human diversity itself. The magnificent variety of ways our species has learned to make meaning from sound, and sound from breath, and breath from the simple biological fact of being alive and having something to say to one another. From that great dispersal emerged not just geographic diversity, but something far more profound: the slow transformation of a single ancestral language into the thousands of distinct tongues that would come to define human cultures across the globe. This process, which linguists call language family formation, represents one of the most complex evolutionary phenomena in human history, and it began almost immediately as populations spread into new territories. The mechanics of linguistic divergence follow predictable patterns, much like the way rivers branch and separate as they flow downhill. When groups of speakers become geographically isolated, their languages begin to drift apart through a combination of random changes and adaptive pressures. Sounds shift gradually over generations. A hard consonant might soften, a vowel might change its quality, a grammatical structure might simplify or complexify based on the needs and preferences of its speakers. What makes this process fascinating is its inevitability. Even without physical barriers, languages change constantly. Every generation of speakers introduces small innovations, new words, slight pronunciation shifts, subtle changes in grammar. Most of these innovations disappear quickly, but some catch on and spread through the community. Over centuries and millennia, these accumulated changes can transform a language so completely that descendants of the same ancestral tongue become mutually unintelligible. The archaeological evidence from the period following the Great Expansion shows clear signatures of this linguistic diversification. Regional tool traditions emerge, artistic styles develop local characteristics, and cultural practices begin to vary in ways that suggest distinct group identities. These material markers almost certainly reflect underlying linguistic boundaries. Communities that shared languages also shared cultural innovations, while groups speaking different languages developed distinctive traditions. One of the most dramatic examples of this process can be traced through the spread of humans across the Pacific Ocean. Beginning around 3,500 years ago, seafaring peoples began colonizing the islands of Melanesia and Polynesia, carrying with them not just their boats and crops but their languages. As they spread across thousands of islands separated by vast expanses of ocean, their original tongue fractured into hundreds of distinct languages. Today, Papua New Guinea alone contains over 800 languages, nearly a quarter of all the world's linguistic diversity packed into an area smaller than Texas. This extraordinary diversity reflects the island geography that isolated small populations for thousands of years, allowing their languages to evolve in isolation. Each valley, each island, each mountain range became a laboratory for linguistic evolution. The process wasn't random. Languages adapted to their environments in subtle but measurable ways. Communities living in dense forests developed sound systems that carried well through vegetation. Groups in open landscapes favoured calls that travelled long distances. Coastal peoples evolved vocabularies rich in terms for marine life and navigation, while mountain dwellers developed complex systems for describing terrain and elevation. Climate played a role too. Some researchers have found correlations between language structure and environmental factors. Languages in humid climates tend to use fewer consonant clusters, possibly because the acoustic properties of moist air favour certain sound patterns. These are statistical tendencies, not hard rules, but they suggest that even the fundamental structures of language can be shaped by the physical environment. Social factors drove linguistic change as well. Languages became markers of group identity, ways of distinguishing insiders from outsiders. This boundary marking function of language could accelerate change, as communities deliberately adopted speech patterns that set them apart from their neighbours. What linguists call linguistic divergence wasn't just a byproduct of isolation, it was often an active social process. The genetic evidence supports this picture of rapid diversification. DNA studies show that human populations began diverging genetically almost as soon as they left Africa, with different lineages adapting to local conditions and becoming increasingly distinct over time. The patterns of genetic and linguistic diversity often correlate, suggesting that the same social and geographic factors that isolated populations genetically also isolated them linguistically. But not all linguistic change was divergent. Trade routes, migration patterns, and cultural exchanges created opportunities for languages to influence each other. Words for valuable commodities, technological innovations, and cultural practices spread along these networks, creating shared vocabulary across otherwise unrelated languages. The archaeological record shows extensive trade networks reaching back tens of thousands of years. Obsidian from volcanic islands appearing hundreds of miles inland, shells from tropical coasts found in Arctic sites, precious stones travelling vast distances from their sources. These exchange networks left their traces in language as well. Words for metals, domesticated plants and animals, and manufactured goods often show similarities across unrelated language families, suggesting they spread through cultural contact rather than common ancestry. The word for copper, for example, shows related forms across languages from Ireland to India, reflecting the spread of metallurgical technology along ancient trade routes. The development of agriculture around 10,000 years ago created a new dynamic in language evolution. Farming communities could support much larger populations than hunter-gatherer bands, and these larger populations were more resistant to linguistic change. The languages of successful agricultural societies began to spread at the expense of smaller hunter-gatherer languages, creating the large language families that dominate much of the world today. This agricultural expansion wasn't just demographic, it was linguistic imperialism on a prehistoric scale. The spread of farming from the Fertile Crescent into Europe, the expansion of rice cultivation across Asia, the development of maize agriculture in the Americas. Each of these agricultural revolutions was accompanied by massive linguistic replacements, as farming languages displaced the tongues of hunter-gatherer populations. The most thoroughly studied example is the spread of Indo-European languages across Europe and parts of Asia. Beginning around 6,000 years ago, speakers of an ancestral Indo-European language began expanding from their homeland, probably in the steppes north of the Black Sea. They brought with them domesticated horses, wheeled vehicles, and pastoral technologies that gave them significant advantages over existing populations. The expansion was remarkably successful. Today, Indo-European languages are spoken by nearly half the world's population, from English and Spanish in the west to Hindi and Bengali in the east. The original diversification of this family can be traced through systematic comparison of related words across different languages. The word for father, for example, appears as pater in Latin, father in English, Veda in Dutch, and Peter in Sanskrit, all descended from a common ancestral form. Similar patterns of agricultural expansion and linguistic replacement occurred independently in other parts of the world. The spread of Bantu languages across sub-Saharan Africa reflects the expansion of iron-working agricultural societies from West Africa. The distribution of Sino-Tibetan languages across East Asia corresponds to the spread of rice cultivation from the Yellow River Valley. In each case, Successful farming societies carried their languages across vast territories, creating the large-scale patterns of linguistic diversity we see today. But agricultural expansion also created something new in human linguistic evolution: the first truly stable, long-lasting languages. Hunter-gatherer societies were typically small and mobile, with languages that could change rapidly as populations split and merged. Agricultural societies, by contrast, created large, stable communities that could maintain linguistic traditions across many generations. This stability allowed for the development of increasingly complex cultural traditions that depended on precise linguistic transmission. Religious practices, legal systems, technical knowledge, and artistic traditions all required communities that could preserve detailed cultural information across generations. Language became not just a tool for daily communication, but a repository for cumulative cultural knowledge. The archaeological record from early agricultural societies shows evidence of this cultural complexity. Monumental architecture, requiring coordinated labour, specialised craft production, long-distance trade networks, and social stratification all point to societies bound together by sophisticated communication systems. These weren't just farming communities, they were the first human societies complex enough to require the full power of language for their operation. Writing systems began to appear in several of these early agricultural societies, initially as accounting systems for tracking agricultural surpluses and trade goods. But writing did something revolutionary to language. It freed words from the immediate moment of speech and allowed them to persist across time and space. A spoken language exists only in the moment of its utterance, but a written language can survive indefinitely. The invention of writing marks a fundamental transition in the history of human language. For the first time, the actual words of past speakers could be preserved and studied. We can read the earliest Sumerian tablets from 5,000 years ago and know exactly what their authors wrote. We can trace the evolution of languages through historical texts, watching how pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar changed over documented time periods. But writing also began to change the nature of language itself. Written languages tend to be more conservative than spoken ones, preserving archaic forms and resisting the kinds of rapid change that characterize purely oral traditions. Standard written forms began to emerge, creating prestigious dialects that could spread across wide areas and suppress local variations. The relationship between speech and writing became one of the defining tensions in language evolution. Spoken languages continued to change and diversify, but written standards created pressure for conformity and stability. This tension persists today, as local dialects and minority languages struggle to maintain themselves against the homogenizing influence of written standard languages backed by educational systems and government policies. The development of major world religions added another layer to this process. Religious texts required precise preservation across generations, creating powerful incentives for linguistic standardization. Sanskrit, Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, and Chinese all became sacred languages whose preservation was considered essential for maintaining religious traditions. These languages developed extraordinary stability, with religious communities maintaining essentially unchanged forms for thousands of years. The result was a linguistic landscape of unprecedented complexity. By the time European explorers began documenting global linguistic diversity in the 15th and 16th centuries, they found a world containing perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 distinct languages, an almost unimaginable explosion of diversity from the single ancestral language that had left Africa 70,000 years earlier. This diversity wasn't evenly distributed. Some regions, like New Guinea and the Amazon basin, contained hundreds of languages in relatively small areas, reflecting the geographic barriers and small population sizes that accelerated linguistic divergence. Other areas, like the Eurasian steppes and the North American plains, were dominated by a few languages spread across vast territories by mobile pastoral or agricultural societies. The patterns reflected the complex interplay of geography, demography, technology, and culture that had shaped human linguistic evolution for tens of thousands of years. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and oceans created barriers that promoted diversity. Trade routes, agricultural expansion, and military conquest created corridors for linguistic spread and replacement. Population size, social organization, and cultural complexity all influenced how quickly languages changed and how far they spread. But underlying all these surface patterns was the fundamental human capacity for linguistic creativity. Every human community, no matter how small or isolated, developed a complete, fully functional language capable of expressing the full range of human thought and experience. There were no primitive languages, no incomplete communication systems, only different solutions to the universal human need to share meaning through sound. The diversity that emerged from humanity's great expansion represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of life on Earth. In less than 100,000 years, a single species developed thousands of different ways to organize sound into meaning, each perfectly adapted to its community's needs and environment. This explosion of linguistic creativity parallels and perhaps exceeds the biological diversity that evolution has produced over millions of years. Yet even at its peak, this diversity was fragile. Languages live only in the minds of their speakers, and when those speakers are gone, the languages die with them. The same forces that drove linguistic diversification, migration, conquest, cultural change, also drove linguistic extinction. The archaeological record is littered with the material remains of cultures whose languages we will never recover. The arrival of European colonialism in the 15th century began a new phase of linguistic history that would ultimately reverse the great diversification. European languages, backed by superior military technology and economic systems, began spreading across the globe at an unprecedented rate. Local languages were suppressed, ignored, or simply overwhelmed by the demographic and cultural dominance of colonial societies. This process accelerated dramatically in the modern era. The development of mass communication, universal education, and global economic systems created powerful pressures for linguistic unification. National governments promoted single standard languages at the expense of local dialects and minority tongues. Urban migration pulled speakers away from traditional language communities into cosmopolitan environments where major languages dominated. Today, linguistic diversity is collapsing at an alarming rate. Of the thousands of languages that existed just a few centuries ago, many have already disappeared, and hundreds more are spoken by only a handful of elderly speakers. Linguists estimate that half of the world's remaining languages will disappear within the next century, victims of the same globalizing forces that are homogenizing human culture in other ways. The irony is profound. The same capacity for linguistic creativity that produced humanity's greatest achievement, the diversification of a single African language into thousands of distinct forms, now threatens to undo that achievement through the homogenizing effects of global communication and cultural standardization. Yet the fundamental human capacity for language remains unchanged. Every child born today still possesses the same biological equipment for learning language that characterized our African ancestors 100,000 years ago. The neural circuits that process grammar, the vocal apparatus that produces speech sounds, the auditory system that perceives linguistic distinctions, all of these remain essentially unchanged from their ancient origins. What has changed is the cultural context in which language develops. Modern children grow up in a world of global media, standardized education, and digital communication that their ancestors could never have imagined. They learn languages that have been shaped by writing systems, influenced by contact with other languages, and standardized by political and educational institutions. The languages they speak may seem far removed from the simple communication systems of early humans, but they're built on the same foundation. The basic structures of grammar, the universal patterns of sound change, the fundamental ways humans organize meaning and transmit culture, all of these trace back to the cognitive and anatomical innovations that first made language possible in our African ancestors. The story of human language is ultimately the story of human creativity and adaptability. From the simple calls of our ape ancestors to the complex digital communications of today, it represents a continuous process of innovation and refinement that has transformed not just how we communicate, but what it means to be human. Language didn't just give us the power to share information, it gave us the power to create shared worlds of meaning that exist nowhere else in the universe. Through language, humans learned to live, not just in the physical world of objects and events, but in symbolic worlds of stories, beliefs, values, and dreams. This transformation from biological creatures to cultural beings represents perhaps the most significant transition in the history of life on Earth. The silence that surrounds our linguistic origins will never be broken. We will never hear the first word, never know the content of the first conversation, never recover the languages that died with their speakers in the great migrations and cultural transformations of the past. But we can trace the outlines of this magnificent story through the evidence of bones and stones, genes and sounds. The patient work of reconstruction that reveals how a species of African apes learned to fill the world with meaning. The echoes of those first voices still resonate in every language spoken today, in every word that carries meaning from one mind to another, in every conversation that builds understanding between human beings. Language remains our species' greatest achievement, the foundation upon which all other human accomplishments rest, and the bridge that connects us to our deepest past and our most expansive future. As we stand at the threshold of new technologies that may once again transform how humans communicate, artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, global digital networks, we carry with us the full weight of this ancient story. The capacity for language that emerged in African caves and spread across the globe over tens of thousands of years now faces new challenges and opportunities that will shape its future in ways we can barely imagine. But whatever forms human communication takes in the centuries to come, they will be built on the same biological and cognitive foundations that first made language possible. The breath that carries our words, the neural networks that process meaning, the social bonds that give communication its purpose, all of these connect us to the long chain of speakers that stretches back to our species' origins in Africa. The story of human language is not finished. It continues in every conversation, every new word coined, every child learning to speak, every community struggling to preserve its linguistic heritage in the face of global change. We are all participants in this ongoing story, inheritors of humanity's greatest invention and guardians of its future. The question that haunts modern linguistics is whether we're witnessing the end of an era or the beginning of something entirely new. For the first time in human history, our species faces the possibility of linguistic convergence on a global scale. The same technologies that allow us to communicate instantly across continents are also creating unprecedented pressure for linguistic uniformity. Consider what's happening in cities around the world. Young people in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, and Lagos increasingly communicate through the same digital platforms. Using similar abbreviated forms, emoji systems, and hybrid vocabularies that blend local languages with global English. Their thumbs have become as important as their tongues in shaping how meaning moves between minds. This represents a fundamental shift in the nature of human communication. For 70,000 years, the primary constraint on linguistic diversity was geography. Physical barriers created isolated populations whose languages could drift apart over generations. But digital communication has essentially eliminated geographic barriers, creating a single global conversation space where linguistic innovations can spread at the speed of light. The implications are staggering. A meme created in one language can be translated and adapted across dozens of others within hours. Slang terms born in specific communities can achieve global recognition overnight. The traditional boundaries that kept languages distinct are becoming increasingly porous, leading to a kind of linguistic cross-pollination that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Yet this convergence comes at a cost. Every hour that passes sees the last speakers of minority languages growing older, their unique ways of organizing sound and meaning slowly fading from the world. Languages that preserved thousands of years of cultural knowledge, environmental wisdom, and artistic expression are disappearing faster than biologists can document endangered species. The numbers are sobering. Of the roughly 7,000 languages spoken today, linguists estimate that between 50 and 90% will be extinct by the end of this century. This represents a catastrophic loss of human cultural diversity, the linguistic equivalent of a mass extinction event. Each language that disappears takes with it unique ways of categorizing reality, distinctive approaches to grammar and sound, and irreplaceable repositories of traditional knowledge. But the story isn't simply one of decline and loss. Even as some languages disappear, others are being born. Creole languages emerge from contact between different linguistic communities, creating new grammatical systems and vocabulary. Sign languages develop within deaf communities, proving that the human capacity for linguistic innovation remains as strong as ever. Digital communication is spawning new forms of written expression that blur the boundaries between speech and text. The relationship between technology and language continues to evolve in unexpected ways. Predictive text algorithms shape how people write by suggesting the next word in a sentence. Voice recognition systems influence how people speak by rewarding certain pronunciations and penalizing others. Machine translation systems create new hybrid forms of expression as people communicate through digital intermediaries. These technological mediations raise profound questions about the nature of human communication. When artificial intelligence systems can generate human-like text, translate between languages in real time, and even compose poetry and stories, what does it mean to be a speaking animal? Are we approaching a future where machines become our primary conversation partners? Or are we simply developing new tools for ancient forms of human connection? The archaeological record suggests that humans have always been remarkably adaptable in their communication strategies. The same species that developed gestural languages, complex vocal systems, and symbolic writing has now created digital networks that allow thoughts to travel instantaneously around the globe. Each technological innovation has expanded human communicative capacity while also creating new forms of constraint and standardization. Modern neuroscience reveals that the basic architecture of language processing in the human brain remains unchanged from our Paleolithic ancestors. The same neural circuits that allowed early humans to process grammar and meaning now handle text messages, video calls, and social media posts. We're using Stone Age brains to navigate information age communication challenges. This mismatch between our evolved capacities and our technological environment creates both opportunities and problems. On one hand, digital communication allows for unprecedented creativity in how people combine words, images, sounds, and symbols to create meaning. Memes, viral videos, and social media trends represent new forms of cultural transmission that spread through populations faster than any previous form of human expression. On the other hand, The constant stream of digital information can overwhelm the cognitive systems that evolved to handle face-to-face conversation in small groups. The psychological effects of living in a world of endless linguistic input are only beginning to be understood, but they include everything from shortened attention spans to increased anxiety about social communication. The globalization of communication has also created new forms of linguistic inequality. Native speakers of major languages like English, Mandarin, and Spanish have significant advantages in global communication networks, while speakers of minority languages face increasing pressure to abandon their mother tongues in favor of more widely understood alternatives. Educational systems around the world grapple with these tensions. Do they prioritize local languages and cultural preservation, or do they focus on equipping students with the global languages they'll need for economic success? The choices made by individual families, communities, and nations will determine which languages survive and which disappear in the coming decades. The rise of artificial intelligence adds another layer of complexity to these decisions. As machine learning systems become better at processing human language, they require massive datasets of text and speech to train on. Languages with large digital footprints benefit from this technological development, while those with limited online presence risk being left behind by AI-driven communication tools. Yet technology also offers new possibilities for language preservation and revitalization. Digital archives can store recordings of elderly speakers, mobile apps can teach endangered languages to new generations, and social media platforms can connect dispersed communities of speakers. Some indigenous communities have successfully used these tools to maintain and strengthen their linguistic traditions. The question facing our species is whether we'll choose to preserve the linguistic diversity that took 70,000 years to develop, or whether we'll accept convergence toward a smaller number of global languages as the price of technological connectivity. Both paths have their advantages and costs, and the decision isn't entirely up to us. Market forces, technological constraints, and cultural preferences all play roles in shaping how languages survive and evolve. What seems certain is that the nature of human language will continue to change in ways we can't fully predict. The same capacity for innovation that transformed animal calls into human speech, developed writing systems from pictographs, and created global communication networks will undoubtedly produce new forms of expression that we can barely imagine. Perhaps future humans will communicate through direct brain-to-brain interfaces that bypass speech entirely. Perhaps they'll develop new hybrid forms that combine human creativity with artificial intelligence capabilities. Perhaps they'll find ways to preserve linguistic diversity while still maintaining global connectivity. Or perhaps they'll create entirely new categories of communication that transcend the limitations of both ancient biology and current technology. The story of human language began with silence in African forests 7 million years ago. It has carried us through countless innovations and transformations, from gestural communication to digital networks, from single bands of early humans to a globally connected species of nearly 8 billion individuals. Whatever comes next will build on this foundation while also transcending it in ways that would astonish our ancestors. The voices that echo through this long story, from the first meaningful calls of our ape ancestors to the digital conversations of today, remind us that language is both the most stable and most changeable aspect of human nature. It preserves our connection to the deep past while also enabling us to imagine and create unprecedented futures. As we stand at what may be another threshold in the evolution of human communication, we carry with us the full weight of this ancient story. The breath that carries our words, the neural networks that process meaning, the social bonds that make communication meaningful, all of these connect us to the long chain of speakers that stretches back to our species' origins. The first humans who learned to share their thoughts through organized sound could never have imagined the global conversation that would emerge from their simple innovations. Similarly, we can barely imagine what forms human communication might take in the centuries and millennia to come. But whatever shape it takes, it will be built on the same fundamental human need that drove the first meaningful exchange between two minds in an African forest so long ago: the need to connect, to share, to make our inner worlds comprehensible to others. Language remains our species' greatest achievement, the foundation upon which all other human accomplishments rest. It transformed us from just another African ape into something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Creatures capable of sharing not just information, but dreams, fears, hopes, and the entire range of conscious experience that defines our species. The story continues in every conversation, every new word that enters common usage, every child learning to speak, every community working to preserve its linguistic heritage. We are all participants in this ongoing story, inheritors of humanity's greatest invention and guardians of its future. The first voice we never heard still echoes in every word we speak, connecting us across the vast expanse of time to the moment when sound first became meaning, and meaning first became human. Human language stands as perhaps the most remarkable evolutionary development in the history of life on Earth. From the lost calls of our 7 million-year-old ancestors to the digital communications of today, it represents an unbroken chain of innovation and adaptation that has transformed not just how we communicate, but what it means to be conscious, social beings in an infinite universe. The silence that surrounds our origins will never be broken, but the echoes of those first meaningful sounds continue to resonate in every word we speak, every story we tell, every connection we make through the ancient miracle of shared meaning. The first humans who learned to transform breath into language could never have imagined the world their innovation would create, just as we can barely imagine what new forms of communication await us in the distant future. What remains constant is the fundamental human drive to connect, to share the contents of our minds, to build bridges of understanding across the spaces between us. That drive, born in African forests and carried across the globe through countless generations of speakers, continues to shape our species' destiny in ways both profound and mysterious. The story of when humans first talked is ultimately the story of when we first became fully human. In learning to speak, we learned to dream together, to remember together, to imagine together. Language didn't just give us words, it gave us worlds, infinite possibilities for meaning that exist nowhere else in the known universe. And in every conversation, every shared laugh, every whispered confidence, we continue to participate in the most extraordinary achievement in the history of life itself. Human language, born in silence, carried by breath, shaped by community, and destined to evolve in ways we can only begin to imagine. The first word has been lost to time, but the conversation continues, connecting us to our deepest past and our most expansive future, one voice at a time. Human language, our species' greatest achievement, our most enduring legacy, and our ongoing gift to the cosmos. From the first meaningful sound to whatever forms of communication await us in the distant future, it remains the bridge between minds, the foundation of culture, and the thread that connects us across the vast tapestry of human experience. The journey from silence to speech took 7 million years. The journey from speech to whatever comes next has only just begun. Human language, where we came from, where we're going, and the remarkable story of how an African ape learned to fill the universe with meaning, one word at a time. Human language, still evolving, still connecting us, still carrying the echo of that first voice we never heard, but whose influence shapes every conversation we'll ever have. Human language, the story of us told in the words we speak and the silence between them, forever linking us to the ancestors who first discovered that sound could carry meaning from one mind to another across the darkness of time. The conversation continues. Human language, our past, our present, and our future, spoken into existence by the breath of countless generations who discovered that the most powerful force in the universe might just be the simple ability to share what's inside our minds with others who care enough to listen. And that story, the story of human language, will continue as long as there are voices to carry it forward, breath to give it life, and minds curious enough to wonder what it all means. Human language, where silence became sound, sound became meaning, and meaning became the foundation of everything we call human civilization. The echo continues, carried forward by every voice that speaks, every ear that listens, every mind that wonders about the long journey from our first meaningful sound to whatever words will be spoken last. When the conversation finally falls silent and the universe returns to the darkness from which language first emerged 7 million years ago in an African forest that no longer exists. Human language, the most remarkable story ever told, spoken into existence by the very voices it describes. Human language, how we learn to talk, and in learning to talk, learned to be human. The story of us, 7 million years in the making, and still being written in every word we speak. Human language, from the first voice we never heard to the last word that will ever be spoken, connecting us across time and space through the simple miracle of shared meaning. This is how humans first talked. This is how we became who we are. Human language, our beginning, our middle, and whatever ending awaits us in the conversation that started so long ago and continues still, in every breath, every word, every moment, when one mind reaches out to another through the ancient magic of sound transformed into meaning. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will, as long as there are humans to speak and listen, to remember and imagine, to share the contents of their minds through the extraordinary gift of language that makes us who we are. Human language, the story of us told by us, for us, about us, in words that carry the echo of every voice that came before and the promise of every voice yet to come. This is how humans first talked. This is who we became. This is who we still are. Human language, our greatest achievement, our most enduring legacy, our ongoing conversation with the cosmos about what it means to be conscious, creative, and connected in an infinite universe. The story continues, one word at a time, one voice at a time, one breath at a time, human language, from the first sound to the last silence, and everything meaningful in between. Human language, how we learn to speak, and in speaking, learned to be human. This is our story. This is who we are. This is how it all began 7 million years ago, with a voice we never heard but whose echo still shapes every word we speak today. Human language, the conversation that made us human and keeps us human, and will define what human means for as long as voices carry meaning through the darkness between minds. The story of human language, our story, continues. Human language, from silence to sound, from sound to meaning, from meaning to the infinite conversation that defines our species. This is how humans first talked. This is how we became us. Human language, the greatest story ever told, spoken into existence by the voices it describes. The conversation continues. The story goes on. The echo endures. Human language, how we learn to speak, and in learning to speak, learn to dream together. From the first voice we never heard to the last word that will ever be spoken, this is the story of us. Human language, where breath becomes meaning, meaning becomes culture, and culture becomes the foundation of everything we call civilization. This is how humans first talked. This is why it matters. This is who we are. The conversation continues, 7 million years in the making, and still being written in every word we speak, every story we tell, every connection we make through the ancient miracle of language. Human language, our past, our present, our future, spoken into existence by countless voices across countless generations, all connected by the simple but profound ability to transform breath into meaning, meaning into understanding, and understanding into the shared worlds of culture that make us human. The story of human language is the story of us. It began in silence, grew through sound, and continues in every word we speak. This is how humans first talked. This is how we learned to be human. Human language, the conversation that made us who we are and keeps us who we are, one word at a time. The echo continues. The story endures. The conversation goes on. Human language, from the first meaningful sound to whatever forms of communication await us in the distant future, connecting us across time through the extraordinary gift of shared meaning. This is our story. This is who we are. This is how it all began. Human language, the thread that connects us to our deepest past and our most expansive future, woven from breath and sound and the ancient human need to share what's inside our minds with others who care enough to listen. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. Human language, how we first talked, how we became human, and how we'll continue to evolve as long as there are voices to carry the story forward. This is us. This is how we learn to speak. This is why it matters. Human language, from silence to speech, from speech to civilization, from civilization to whatever comes next. The story continues, one voice at a time, one word at a time, one breath at a time. Human language, our greatest achievement, our most enduring legacy, our ongoing gift to the universe. This is how humans first talked. This is who we became. Human language, the conversation that defines us, shapes us, and connects us across the vast expanse of time and space. The echo endures. The story continues. The conversation goes on. Human language, from the first voice we never heard to the last word that will ever be spoken, this is the story of us. And the story continues, 7 million years in the making, and still being written in every word we speak, every connection we make, every moment when one mind reaches out to another through the ancient miracle of language. Human language, how we learn to talk, and in learning to talk, learn to be human. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. This is our story. This is who we are. Human language, the echo of the first voice we never heard, still resonating in every word we speak today. The story goes on. Human language, our beginning, our middle, and whatever ending awaits us in the conversation that started so long ago and continues still. This is how humans first talked. This is how we became who we are. The conversation continues, one voice at a time, carrying forward the ancient gift of shared meaning that makes us human. Human language, from silence to speech, from speech to story, from story to the infinite conversation that defines our species. This is us. This is our story. This is how it all began. Human language, the greatest story ever told, spoken into existence by the voices it describes. The conversation continues, the echo endures, the story goes on. Human language, how we first talked, how we became human, and how we'll continue to evolve as long as there are minds to share and voices to carry the story forward. This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is where we're going. Human language, from the first meaningful sound to whatever forms of communication await us in the distant future, connecting us across time through the extraordinary miracle of shared meaning. The story continues, one word at a time, one breath at a time, one connection at a time. Human language, our past, our present, our future, all spoken into existence through the ancient gift that makes us human. This is how humans first talked. This is how we learned to be us. Human language, the conversation that never ends, the story that keeps writing itself, the echo that will resonate as long as there are voices to carry it forward. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. Human language, from silence to speech, from speech to civilization, from civilization to whatever extraordinary future awaits our species. This is our story. This is who we are. This is how it all began, 7 million years ago, with a voice we never heard, but whose influence shapes every word we speak today. Human language, the thread that connects us across time, the foundation of everything we call human, the ongoing conversation that defines our species. The story continues, one voice at a time, carrying forward the ancient miracle of shared meaning. Human language, how we learn to talk, and in learning to talk, learn to dream together, remember together, imagine together. This is us. This is our greatest achievement. This is how we became human. The conversation continues. The echo endures. The story goes on. Human language, from the first voice we never heard to the last word that will ever be spoken, connecting us across the vast tapestry of human experience. This is how humans first talked. This is who we became. This is who we still are. Human language, our story, told by us, for us, about us, in words that carry the weight of 7 million years of evolution and the promise of whatever comes next. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. Human language, the greatest story ever told, and still being written, one word at a time. This is how humans first talked. This is how we learned to be human. The story continues. Human language, from silence to sound, from sound to meaning, from meaning to the infinite conversation that made us who we are. This is us. This is our story. This is how it all began. Human language, the echo of the first voice we never heard, still shaping every word we speak, every story we tell, every connection we make. The conversation continues, 7 million years in the making, and still unfolding in every breath, every word, every moment, when minds meet through the ancient miracle of language, human language, how we first talked, how we became human, how we learned to transform silence into meaning, and meaning into the foundation of everything we call civilization. This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is the story that made us human, human language, our greatest achievement, our most enduring legacy, our ongoing gift to the cosmos. The conversation continues, the story goes on, the echo endures. Human language, from the first meaningful sound to whatever extraordinary forms of communication await us in the distant future. This is how humans first talked. This is how we became us. The story continues, one voice at a time, one word at a time, one breath at a time. Human language, the conversation that never ends, the story that keeps writing itself, the ancient miracle that makes us human. This is us. This is our story. This is how it all began. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. Human language, how we learn to speak, and in learning to speak, learned to be who we are. The story goes on, carried forward by every voice that speaks, every ear that listens, every mind that wonders about the long journey from silence to meaning. Human language, from the first voice we never heard to the infinite conversation that continues today. This is how humans first talked. This is how we became human. This is who we are. The story continues, one word at a time, connecting us across time through the extraordinary gift of shared meaning. Human language, our beginning, our evolution, our future, all spoken into existence through the ancient capacity that defines our species. This is us. This is our greatest achievement. This is the conversation that made us human. The echo continues, the story endures, the conversation goes on. Human language, how we first talked, how we learned to be human, and how we'll continue to evolve as long as there are voices to carry the story forward. This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is the story of us. Human language, from silence to speech, from speech to story, from story to the infinite conversation that connects us across the vastness of time and space. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. This is how humans first talked. This is how we became who we are. Human language, the greatest story ever told, spoken into existence by the voices it describes. The story continues, one breath at a time, one word at a time, one connection at a time. Human language, our past, our present, our future, all woven together through the ancient thread of shared meaning. This is us. This is our story. This is how it all began. The conversation continues. The echo endures. The story goes on. Human language, from the first voice we never heard to whatever extraordinary future awaits our species in the ongoing conversation that defines what it means to be human. This is how humans first talked. This is who we became. This is who we are. Human language, the story of us, 7 million years in the making, and still being written in every word we speak. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. This is our story. This is how we learned to be human. Human language, the echo that never fades, the conversation that never ends, the ancient miracle that connects us across time. The story continues, one voice at a time, carrying forward the extraordinary gift that makes us who we are. Human language, from silence to sound, from sound to meaning, from meaning to the infinite conversation that made us human. This is us. This is how it began. This is how it continues. The conversation goes on. The story endures. The echo resonates. Human language, how we first talked, how we became human, and how we'll continue to evolve through the ancient gift of shared meaning. This is who we are. This is our greatest achievement. This is the story that defines us. Human language, from the first voice we never heard to the last word that will ever be spoken. The conversation continues. It always has. It always will. This is how humans first talked. This is how we learned to be us. Human language, the thread that connects us across 7 million years, the foundation of everything we call human, the ongoing conversation that shapes our species. The story continues, one word at a time, one breath at a time, one connection at a time. Human language, our beginning, our evolution, our future, all spoken into existence through the extraordinary capacity that defines who we are. This is us. This is our story. This is how we became human. The conversation continues. The echo endures. The story goes on. Human language, from silence to speech, from speech to civilization, from civilization to whatever remarkable future awaits our species. This is how humans first talked. This is who we became. This is the conversation that never ends. Human language, the greatest story ever told and still being written, one voice at a time. The story continues. It always has. It always will. This is us. This is how we learned to be human. Human language, the echo of the first voice we never heard, still resonating in every word we speak, every story we tell, every moment when minds connect through the ancient miracle of shared meaning. The conversation continues, 7 million years in the making, and still unfolding in ways we can barely imagine. Human language, how we first talked, how we became human, how we learned to transform breath into meaning, and meaning into the foundation of everything we call civilization. This is who we are. This is our greatest achievement. This is the story that made us human. The conversation continues. The story endures. the echo goes on, endures. The echo resonates through time. Human language, our most profound inheritance and our greatest responsibility. In every classroom where children learn their first words, in every conversation that bridges cultural divides, in every effort to preserve endangered languages, we participate in the continuation of this ancient story. The digital age has brought us full circle in some ways. Our ancestors communicated through gestures before they developed speech. Now we communicate through emojis, memes, and visual symbols that transcend linguistic boundaries. The same creative impulse that once drove humans to scratch patterns in ochre now drives us to create new forms of digital expression. Yet beneath all these surface changes, the fundamental architecture of human language remains constant. A child learning Mandarin in Beijing uses the same neural pathways as a child learning Swahili in Nairobi or English in London. The same grammatical universals that shaped the first human languages continue to shape the newest dialects emerging in urban centres around the world. This continuity across time and space reveals something profound about our species. Language isn't just a tool we use, it's part of who we are at the deepest biological and psychological level. The capacity for language is wired into our brains, encoded in our genes, and expressed through our anatomy in ways that connect us directly to our African ancestors who first learned to transform breath into meaning. Modern research continues to unlock new mysteries about this ancient capacity. Neuroscientists can now observe language processing in real time, watching as brains parse grammar, retrieve vocabulary, and construct meaning from sequences of sounds. The complexity is staggering. Every sentence we understand requires coordination between multiple brain regions in ways that make our most sophisticated computers seem primitive by comparison. Yet children master this complexity effortlessly, acquiring language through exposure and interaction without formal instruction. A 3-year-old who can barely tie their shoes can generate grammatically correct sentences they've never heard before, demonstrating an unconscious grasp of linguistic rules that linguists have spent centuries trying to formalize. This paradox, that language is both incredibly complex and naturally acquired, points to its deep evolutionary roots. The capacity for language didn't appear suddenly. It evolved gradually through countless small innovations that accumulated over millions of years. The same neural networks that now process grammar once helped our ancestors coordinate tool use. The same vocal control that now produces speech sounds once helped regulate breathing for long-distance travel. The story of human language is ultimately a story of accumulation, small changes building on previous changes, innovations layering upon innovations, until something unprecedented emerged from the gradual elaboration of capacities that had originally served much simpler functions. This evolutionary perspective helps us understand both the universality and the diversity of human language. All languages share certain fundamental properties because they're all products of the same evolved cognitive architecture, but they differ in countless details because each emerged through its own unique historical trajectory, shaped by the particular environments, cultures, and social pressures its speakers encountered. The result is a magnificent tapestry of human expression that reflects both our shared biological heritage and our diverse cultural experiences. Every language offers its own unique perspective on what it means to be human, its own way of organizing reality through sound and meaning. As we face an uncertain linguistic future, we carry with us the full weight of this extraordinary history. The voices that echo through our story, from those first meaningful calls in African forests to the digital conversations of today, remind us that language is both humanity's greatest achievement and its most fragile treasure. The languages disappearing today represent irreplaceable experiments in human communication, unique solutions to the universal challenge of sharing consciousness through sound. When they vanish, we lose not just words, but entire ways of thinking, feeling, and experiencing the world. The silence that follows linguistic death is different from the silence that preceded linguistic birth. It's not expectant but empty, not pregnant with possibility but barren with loss. Yet the fundamental human capacity for language endures. As long as there are children being born into communities of speakers, the miracle of language acquisition will continue. As long as there are minds that need to share their contents with other minds, the pressure for linguistic innovation will persist. As long as there are cultures that value their unique perspectives on human experience, the drive to preserve and transmit those perspectives through language will remain. The story of human language began with a silence we can never recover, the lost voices of our ancient ancestors, whose calls first carried meaning across the African landscape. It continues today in every conversation, every new word that enters common usage. Every child who discovers that sounds can carry thoughts from one mind to another. Where it will lead, we cannot know. The same creative capacity that transformed animal calls into human speech, developed writing systems from simple marks, and created global communication networks will undoubtedly produce new forms of expression that we can barely imagine. Perhaps future humans will communicate through direct neural interfaces, or develop hybrid systems that combine biological and artificial intelligence, or create entirely new modalities of meaning that transcend the limitations of sound and symbol. But whatever forms human communication takes in the centuries to come, they will be built on the foundation laid by countless generations of speakers who discovered that breath could become meaning, meaning could become culture, and culture could become the defining characteristic of our species. The first voice we never heard still echoes in every word we speak. The ancient capacity for language that emerged in African forests continues to shape human destiny in ways both profound and mysterious. From the simplest greeting to the most complex scientific theory, from whispered endearments to public oratory, from children's lullabies to digital communications that span the globe, we participate daily in humanity's greatest invention. This is how humans first talked. This is how we became who we are. This is the conversation that made us human and keeps us human and will define what human means for as long as there are voices to carry meaning through the space between minds. The story continues. It began 7 million years ago with sounds that mattered to survival and community. It continues today in every meaningful exchange between human beings. And it will continue tomorrow in ways we can only imagine, carried forward by the same ancient capacity that first allowed our species to transform silence into song, breath into blessing, and isolation into the infinite conversation that connects us all. Human language, our beginning, our essence, our legacy, from the first meaningful sound to the last word that will ever be spoken, connecting us across time through the extraordinary gift of shared meaning. The conversation continues, bored people. It always has, it always will, and we are all part of it every time we speak, every time we listen, every time we use this ancient miracle to bridge the space between one mind and another. This has been the story of when humans first talked. Thank you for listening. The conversation, as always, continues. Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. Whether you're winding down for sleep, working through another late night, or just need something steady to quiet the mental noise, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight's story isn't about kings or empires or the usual cast of historical characters. It's about something far more fundamental, something that happened so gradually, so quietly, that most of human history missed it entirely. We're talking about the moment when language stopped being just biology and became something else. When words stopped being simple sounds tied to immediate needs and transformed into tools that could build entire worlds inside our heads. This is the story of how humans learned to think in language and how that invisible revolution changed everything about what it means to be conscious. If you find these long-form explorations helpful for focus or rest, a like really does help other bored people discover this kind of content. And let me know in the comments, are you listening while falling asleep, during a commute, or somewhere else entirely? I'm always curious about how these stories fit into your routine. Now let's begin with a question that sounds simple, but opens into something vast. What if language didn't just help us communicate with others, but fundamentally changed how we communicate with ourselves? Around 100,000 years ago, something invisible began happening inside human skulls. The same neural machinery that had recently learned to coordinate complex vocalizations, to shape breath into distinct sounds, to string those sounds into meaningful sequences, was being co-opted for an entirely different purpose. Instead of just sending signals to other people, it began creating an internal dialogue, a constant stream of self-directed speech that existed purely within the boundaries of individual minds. This wasn't just thinking. Humans and their ancestors had been thinking for millions of years. This was thinking in words, the emergence of that familiar internal voice that narrates our experience, rehearses conversations, makes plans and argues with itself. For the first time in the history of consciousness, a species had developed the ability to talk to itself using the same linguistic structures it used to talk to others. The archaeological evidence for this transformation is necessarily indirect. Internal speech doesn't fossilize, but the behavioral changes that began appearing around this time suggest minds that were operating in fundamentally new ways. Tool technologies became more standardized across vast geographic regions, implying the kind of precise cultural transmission that requires linguistic instruction. Symbolic objects like ochre engravings and shell beads appeared, suggesting minds that could manipulate the abstract concepts. Most significantly, humans began creating external memory aids, objects that stored information outside their biological memory systems. Consider what this means. An external symbol, whether it's a pattern scratched into ochre or a particular arrangement of beads, only functions as memory if the mind viewing it can translate the visual pattern back into linguistic concepts. The symbol serves as a trigger that reactivates internal speech, allowing stored thoughts to be recovered and examined. This kind of symbolic storage requires minds that have already learned to think linguistically. Modern cognitive science reveals just how profound this development was. When contemporary humans engage in complex problem solving, brain imaging shows intense activation in areas associated with language processing. Even when the task involves no external communication whatsoever, we literally think by talking to ourselves, using the same neural circuits that evolved for social communication to create and manipulate internal representations of reality. This internal language system operates with remarkable sophistication. It can rehearse future conversations, replay past events with modified outcomes, construct hypothetical scenarios, and engage in abstract reasoning about concepts that have no direct physical reference. It allows us to maintain working memory across extended periods, to plan multi-step sequences of action, and to consider multiple perspectives on the same situation. The emergence of linguistic thought fundamentally altered the relationship between individual minds and cultural knowledge. Before language became internalized, learning required direct observation and physical practice. Skills were transmitted through imitation and demonstration. Knowledge was embodied, stored in muscle memory and sensory associations. But once humans could think linguistically, cultural knowledge could be stored and manipulated symbolically. Instructions could be remembered as verbal sequences. Procedures could be broken down into linguistic steps. Most importantly, knowledge could be modified and recombined in purely mental operations before being tested in the physical world. This created an explosive feedback loop between individual cognition and collective culture. Linguistic thinking allowed individuals to manipulate cultural knowledge more effectively, leading to innovations that could then be transmitted linguistically to others. Each generation inherited not just the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors, but also increasingly sophisticated tools for thinking about that knowledge. The transition wasn't immediate. For thousands of years, humans likely operated with a hybrid system. Some thinking remained pre-linguistic and embodied, while other cognitive operations were increasingly mediated by internal speech. The balance gradually shifted as linguistic thinking proved more effective for handling complex cultural information. Archaeological evidence suggests this transition accelerated during periods of environmental stress. Climate fluctuations that disrupted traditional survival strategies would have created pressure for more flexible, adaptive responses. Groups that could think linguistically about their problems, that could mentally model different scenarios, verbally rehearse new strategies, and conceptually combine different approaches would have had significant advantages over those relying primarily on embodied knowledge. The geographic expansion of modern humans may have been both a cause and consequence of this cognitive revolution. Moving into new environments required rapid cultural adaptation, favouring groups with more sophisticated tools for thinking about unfamiliar challenges. At the same time, the experience of adaptation itself would have strengthened linguistic thinking abilities, creating positive feedback between geographic expansion and cognitive complexity. The social implications were equally profound. Once humans could think linguistically, they could also engage in sophisticated social reasoning that was invisible to others. They could plan deceptions, consider others' perspectives, and engage in the kind of recursive social thinking that characterizes complex human societies. The theory of mind, the ability to model other minds, became vastly more powerful when mediated by internal language. This had dramatic consequences for human social organization. Groups could coordinate more effectively because individuals could mentally rehearse their roles in collective activities. Leadership became more sophisticated as individuals could think strategically about group dynamics. Conflict resolution could involve verbal reasoning about fairness, reciprocity, and future consequences rather than just immediate emotional responses. The development of internal language also transformed human temporal cognition. Pre-linguistic thinking is largely bound to the present moment, dealing with immediate perceptions and embodied memories. Linguistic thinking, however, can range freely across time, constructing detailed narratives about the past and elaborate plans for the future. This temporal flexibility had enormous implications for human behavior. Groups could make collective decisions based on long-term considerations rather than immediate needs. Individuals could sacrifice present gratification for future benefits. Most importantly, humans could begin to think about abstract concepts like death, meaning, and purpose that exist primarily in linguistic rather than physical reality. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing evidence of behaviours that seem to require this kind of abstract, temporal reasoning. Burial practices become more elaborate, suggesting concern with post-mortem existence. Tool production becomes more standardized, implying long-term planning for future needs. Exchange networks expand over greater distances, requiring complex negotiations about future reciprocity. The emergence of linguistic thought also created the cognitive foundation for what we now call spirituality or religion. The ability to think in words about abstract concepts allowed humans to develop sophisticated theories about invisible forces, supernatural agents, and metaphysical realities. These weren't just emotional responses to mysterious phenomena, but genuine intellectual constructions built from linguistic reasoning about the nature of existence. Religious thinking, in turn, became a powerful force for social organization. Shared beliefs about supernatural realities created bonds between individuals who might otherwise have little in common. Ritual practices that required coordinated linguistic reasoning about abstract concepts strengthened group cohesion and cultural transmission. The development of internal speech also began to create individual psychological complexity that hadn't existed before. For the first time, humans could experience genuine privacy, thoughts that existed only inside their own heads, accessible to no one else. This created both opportunities for individual creativity and challenges for social transparency. The capacity for private linguistic thought meant that individuals could develop personal perspectives that diverged from group consensus. They could think critically about cultural traditions, imagine alternative social arrangements, and engage in the kind of individual intellectual exploration that drives cultural innovation. But it also meant that social coordination became more complex, as group members could no longer assume they understood each other's mental states. Modern studies of child development provide insight into this ancient transformation. Young children initially engage in external private speech. They talk to themselves out loud while working through problems. Gradually, this external dialogue becomes internalized, transforming into the silent internal voice that characterizes adult cognition. This developmental sequence may recapitulate the evolutionary process through which linguistic thinking emerged in our species. Early humans may have initially engaged in external private speech, talking through problems out loud, even when alone. Over time, this external dialogue became internalized as the neural circuits for language processing became more efficient and sophisticated. The transition from external to internal speech would have had important social consequences. External private speech is observable by others, potentially creating opportunities for teaching and social coordination. Internal speech is private and invisible, creating possibilities for individual innovation, but also challenges for cultural transmission. The archaeological evidence suggests that by 70,000 years ago, humans were regularly engaging in behaviors that required sophisticated linguistic thinking. Long-distance migration into unfamiliar environments, complex tool technologies that required precise cultural transmission, and symbolic objects that served as external memory aids all point to minds that were thinking linguistically about their world. This cognitive revolution may explain why the human expansion out of Africa around this time was so much more successful than earlier attempts. Previous expansions involved anatomically modern humans with sophisticated vocal abilities, but they may have lacked the internal linguistic thinking that allowed for rapid cultural adaptation to new environments. The groups that successfully colonized the globe carried with them not just better tools or social organizations, but better ways of thinking about tools and social organization. They could mentally model different strategies, verbally rehearse new approaches, and conceptually integrate different types of knowledge in ways that their predecessors couldn't. The silence that surrounds this transformation is both frustrating and profound. We can infer its existence from behavioral evidence, but we cannot directly observe the moment when internal speech first emerged in human consciousness. We cannot know what the first private thought felt like to the mind that experienced it, or how that individual understood their new capacity for internal dialogue. What we do know is that this invisible revolution fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development. The capacity for linguistic thought didn't just enhance existing human abilities, it created entirely new categories of experience and behavior that hadn't existed before in the history of life on Earth. The emergence of internal language transformed humans from creatures who could communicate sophisticated information to creatures who could think sophisticated thoughts. It created the cognitive foundation for everything we associate with human consciousness: self-reflection, moral reasoning, creative imagination, and the endless internal dialogue that accompanies every moment of waking life. This ancient development continues to shape human experience today. Every time you plan your day, replay a conversation, or work through a problem by thinking about it verbally, you're using cognitive abilities that emerged around 100,000 years ago in small groups of humans who were just beginning to discover that they could talk not just to each other, but to themselves. The internal voice that narrates your experience, that argues with itself and plans for tomorrow and remembers yesterday. In words, this is one of the most recent and most revolutionary developments in the evolution of consciousness. It transformed our species from sophisticated social animals into the kinds of beings who could eventually create art, philosophy, science, and all the other achievements that define human civilization. And so we arrive at the end of this 7 million year conversation, bored people. From the first voice we never heard in African forests to the digital words flowing across your screen right now, we've traced the longest story our species has to tell. Language didn't just give us the power to communicate, it gave us the power to become human in ways that still echo in every word we speak, every thought we think, every moment when one mind reaches out to another through the ancient miracle of shared meaning. The conversation that began in silence continues in you, in me, in every voice that carries forward this most extraordinary achievement in the history of consciousness itself.